Hi everyone. So in this episode of Writing Notes, I'm going to talk to you guys some about the introductions for papers. Now, introductions can be a really challenging component of a paper, especially for emerging writers, partially because introductions are so important. So an introduction is basically the first impression that your readers get of what your paper is about. And so, like all first impressions, it's pretty important to make a good one. So basically an introduction needs to do three things. One is it needs to grab the reader's attention. So this would be what we would call, pretty aptly, an attention grabber. So the purpose or the goal of this is to get the reader interested, get them focused, and get them wanting to read more about what you have to say. The second thing that it needs to do is to provide background, context, and elaboration on what your paper is going to talk about. And then the third thing an introduction needs to do is provide a thesis statement. And you'll want to see my video on thesis statements for more about that. But again, this would be the central argument or claim that your paper is trying to make. So if we divide the introduction up into basically these three parts, we can talk about the attention grabber, the body of the introduction, and the thesis. Again, I'm not going to talk much about the thesis in this video. I'm going to focus on attention grabbing strategies and body of the introduction, context strategies. So the attention grabber is important because this is what hooks your reader's interest, hooks their attention. So a couple of good strategies that you might use would be to start with a rhetorical question or a quote, to start with an anecdote, which would be a short personal story, to start with an interesting fact or statistic or piece of information, something like this. And the tricky part about attention-grabbing strategies is that they can come across as gimmicky, which means they can sound like they're put in just to be an attention-grabbing strategy, rather than sounding like a sort of organic and natural part of the paper, and that can put readers off. So, for instance, you might say you started your paper with the Ben Franklin quote, "A penny saved is a penny earned," and then your paper itself goes on to talk about why arts funding and education is important for children's cognitive development, which is a fine argument to make. The problem is that the Ben Franklin quote is not about arts funding, and it's not about education, it's just about money. So it doesn't feel like it's connected. It feels like it's put in there just for the sake of saying Ben Franklin said, and then you go back to it. And then you never go back to it. So if you can start with something like a rhetorical question that you then sort of try and flesh out the answer to, if you can start with a quote that you then respond to or something like that, those are good ways of getting the audience into the paper. Now, in terms of the body of the introduction itself, you've got a couple of good strategies you can use, or a couple of things that you may find helpful. So one would be to provide historical background. How did we come to the current state of affairs? One would be to provide social, cultural, or political background. What is going on surrounding this debate? What other issues are involved? What else are people concerned about? Things like this. One technique would be to summarize the scholarly debate or the intellectual debate. So here's what different sides of different arguments say. Another approach would be to provide a roadmap. And a roadmap is a good technique because what it does is, it's almost like a methodology section. It tells your reader where you're going. in the paper. So this paper will deal with this issue, and then we'll look at this issue, and we'll examine problems with X thing, whatever it is, and so on and so on. And then you want to get to your thesis. Typically, especially in the sort of fairly short papers that most undergraduate classes require you to write, you want to get to your thesis within the first page, if not within the first half a page. So if the paper is, say, 5 or 6 pages long or longer, you want to get to it within the first page. If it's 2 to 3 pages long, something like that, 4 pages long, first half a paragraph, or first half a page, rather. Because you want time to develop that thesis statement. And you want time to develop that argument in the paper itself. And so what you want to think about when you're planning your introduction and when you're writing your introduction is, how long can this introduction be for the amount of space I have for the paper? So you want to be aware of proportion, because if you've got a 1.5-page long introduction in a 3-page paper, it's using way too much space. So you want to be aware of that. Now, the other thing that I want to do real quick in this video is I actually want to read you an introduction that I wrote and talk about a couple of the strategies that are going on in there. So this is from an essay that I wrote called Visiting Grandmother, a question about the ethics of the friendly teaching persona. So I'm going to read you guys this introduction, and then I'm going to highlight a couple of the strategies that I've used here and why I used them. So this paper starts out. In the past few years, I've gone through 2 graduate teaching assistant training seminars and semester-long pedagogy courses. One at the University of Vermont in the fall of 2009, and the other 2 years later at West Virginia University. It was especially interesting for me to go through the training at WVU because I had 2 years of teaching experience, while roughly 2/3 of my coworkers had never been in front of a class before. I was fascinated by some of the questions my new colleagues asked during our 2-week-long training seminar in August. They are questions I'm sure that I asked 2 years earlier. Questions about how to lead group discussions, how to structure effective peer review, how to respond fairly and productively to student writing. But the question that launched this paper was, how do I establish my authority in the classroom? This is a serious question, especially for new GTAs. Many of us are only a few years older than the students we are instructing, and a good portion of us recently finished our own undergrad degrees. We often don't feel like we really belong, and because we don't feel like real instructors, there's a very real fear that our instructors won't see us as real instructors. And this is something that most of us want to know how to deal with before we set foot in our classrooms on the first day of the semester. So, I've got a couple of good things going on here. So the first thing that this introduction does is actually what's called an anecdote, which again would be a short personal story that connects with what's going on here. So I tell this story about being in the UVM, University of Vermont, and the WVU, West Virginia University, training seminars, and listening to the questions that my colleagues were asking. So this sort of sets us up because we're already establishing, and in this case we're already establishing sets of questions. And so as a reader, the idea is that you start to say, okay, we've got a set of questions. Where is this paper going? What is it that this paper is going to deal with? And then we get here, about halfway down the paragraph, we get a rhetorical question. Sort of a rhetorical question. It's functioning as a rhetorical question. And that is, but the question that launched this paper was, how do I establish my authority in the classroom? So this is giving us the actual focus of this paper. This paper will be about answering the question, how do I establish my authority in the classroom? So this is not exactly a thesis, but this is the guiding research question And then actually the way that this paper is set up is somewhat unusual for Western rhetoric in that it gets to a thesis at the end of the paper after exploring a series of positions and ideas. But this would be our guiding research question, is how do I establish my authority in the classroom? Then what I do is I establish the stakes of this argument. And this is very important for writers to do because we can't assume that readers are going to be interested in something just because it's on the page. So I talk about this being a serious question for new GTAs because of these various reasons. We're typically fairly young, we're not that far away from our own undergrad degrees, we don't feel like we're instructors, we still feel like we're students and peers and things like this. And so these are the reasons why this question matters, the reasons why someone should read this paper, why they should be interested in this topic, not just because I've chosen to write about it, but because there are actual real-world stakes for this. And so these are some of the introductory strategies that I use here. And they create an effective introduction, partially by working together, partially by being good techniques in and of themselves. And so what you want to do when you're working on your own introduction is start figuring out, how do I blend different techniques, which techniques are going to be most useful for the paper that I'm writing, and how do I connect everything that I'm doing in the introduction to the body of the paper itself. And that's how you get to a good introduction.